Welcome to Al Bernstein Unplugged Unboxing. In a 40-year Hall of Fame career, Al has chronicled some of the greatest moments in boxing history. On this podcast, you get to hear him expand on those memories and talk about the current news in the sport of boxing. You also hear Al interview some of the biggest names in the sport. Here's Al Bernstein Unplugged.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. Glad that you joined us for this show on which we're going to get a chance to chat with Todd Snyder, who is a fine boxing author who wrote the book Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. It's a book about Bundini Brown, of course, the sideman, trainer, and hype man for Muhammad Ali during his great career. And the book is published by Hamilcar Publishing, which, by the way, I think is the leading publisher of boxing books, and they have many great titles in their catalog that you can go find. Go check out their website and you'll see they have a lot of great books. Todd's is among them. We also, of course, will answer your questions and chat a little boxing. And for that, let me bring in my co-host, Mr. Trip Mitchell. Trip, how you doing?
I'm doing great, and it's so good to be in the year 2021 for a number of different reasons, but this could be an amazing year in the sport of boxing, but you don't know. But we could have some amazing fights coming up.
Yeah, I think, there are already a number of them on the board for this year that we see already. We already saw we've seen some good fights already. And now we're moving forward with it. And I think we're going to see some big names as the schedule fills in. There's already good fights on the board, but as the schedule fills in, I think we're going to see even more. And I'm very optimistic. I'm optimistic, among other things, about some of the bigger fights being made. We know, for instance, that the likelihood of Joshua and Fury is very, very high. And I think we're going to see, I'll go out on a limb and say we're going to see at least several major fights with promoters and networks kind of figuring out how to make the bigger fighters get together. I know that's always dangerous to make that prediction in boxing, but I just feel like this year, boxing's going to do that because they understand how important it is to do that.
Well, great. Well, let's get right off with the questions. Gerald Moody writes, what are the in-ring accomplishments that Floyd Mayweather had that are unique to him? Great question.
It is a good question, because we all know that Floyd Mayweather is, the singular fighter of his generation, 50-0 record, and skills in the ring that are just extraordinary. And yet, when you look at his resume, one of the things that jumps out to me is just the sheer number of champions, whether they be former, current, or future champions that he fought during his career. And a total of 18 men that held world titles were on his resume. And of course, he defeated all of them because he never lost a fight. And the other intriguing thing is that on that list, there are 4 Hall of Famers, Shane Mosley, Oscar De La Hoya, also Juan Manuel Marquez, and Arturo Gatti, all 4 Hall of Famers that he has beaten. And then there are 3 men that we know are going to be in the Hall of Fame that he's beaten: Manny Pacquiao, Miguel Cotto, and also Canelo Alvarez, who is likely ticketed for boxing's Hall of Fame. So the level of competition he has faced is pretty extraordinary. Now, I know some people nitpick and say there were moments where he selected the right time to fight some of these people, but I don't really know. I don't know if that diminishes the achievement that he had, because there were a lot of those men that he fought at a time when they were quite capable. And so I think the amount of, when you fought 18 men that were at some point world champion and 7 Hall of Famers that you beat, I think that's pretty darn good. So that to me feels like the one thing you would point to for Mayweather.
Okay, our next question, Augustus Tyler IV. Very classy fan, by the way. Al, how is it commentating on fights with little or no crowd? There's nothing like the energy of a packed arena for a fight.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You would think that it would have, and I've talked to other sportscasters who I'm friends with in all sports, and we've discussed this issue because we've all been put in a similar situation. you would think that it would have a bigger impact than it does. When we broadcast a sporting event, while we're aware of the crowd and aware of the excitement, we're doing something that's very singular and very lineal and very directed. And so you're calling this sports action based on what it's generating. And so I think the effect on us is less than people might imagine. I know for me, even in the silence of our bubble, the action generates something that you can get excited about. And I feel like on our broadcast, we've done that. And in hearing other sportscasters, I think they've done it as well. So you're so focused on things that I think you kind of tune out the fact that there isn't a crowd. Of course, it adds to things. It adds to the broadcast. It adds to the event. It's an important element. But we've found out something kind of interesting, I think, during this time, that from a TV standpoint, you can transmit what's going on and have it be interesting and exciting, even without the crowd. And of course, now in many sports, crowds are starting to make their way back in, whether it's boxing or other sports as well. So we'll be hearing that in the near future. Now, one man who heard the crowd cheer many, many times was Muhammad Ali. And the man that was beside him, figuratively and literally for that career, was the great Bundini Brown, who was a fascinating figure. You know, most people think of him as just this hype man that, you know, was all flamboyant and colorful with Muhammad Ali. But he was a lot more than that. And we know that now definitively from reading the book Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype by Todd Snyder. And I had a chance to talk with Todd about what is a very excellent book. Todd, this book that you have written about Bundini Brown, which comes, many years after he was in the public consciousness, but was a fascinating topic to even undertake. What was it that made you want to write a book about Bundini Brown?
You know, a lot of that had to do with my childhood. I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, Cowan, West Virginia, and my father was a boxing trainer. And I grew up in boxing gyms my entire life, and much of my youth was either playing around in the gyms as a kid or following him to fights on the weekend. So, I was always interested in trainers and entourages. I sort of see the sport through that lens.
Right.
And my father's hero was Muhammad Ali, of course. And one of his assistant trainers in the gym, we called him Bundini Dean, was the nickname we had for him because he was my dad's right-hand man. So my whole life was, watching those Ali documentaries. I think the first book I ever read cover to cover was Ali's biography from '75. So Ali was my dad's hero and my father was my hero. So vicariously, Ali was the greatest thing in the world to me as a kid. But the lens I've always viewed the sport is through trainers. I've always been interested in trainers and entourages. That was sort of my introduction to the sport. The other reason that I was attracted to Bundini is today I'm an English professor at Siena College in Albany, New York, where I teach courses on hip hop history. And I've always viewed Bundini as a pre-hip hop icon.
Yeah.
I grew up in the 80s and, hip hop was my first love, like boxing was my father's first love. And Bundini was a little bit of what we both loved. He was Ali's poet laureate in the corner. And to me, Bundini was sort of pre-hip hop. He was sort of he and Ali and the rhymes they put together sort of created the archetype for what MCs would do a couple decades later. And it was back in 2014 where Chuck D of Public Enemy had visited my college for this event that I host called Siena Hip Hop Week. And one of my students asked Chuck D, was Ali the first rapper? And the reason he asked that is Chuck was the narrator to that ESPN documentary, Ali Rap.
Right.
And Chuck said, sure, it's hard to argue that Ali wasn't the first rapper. And I jumped in and said, does that mean Bundini's the first hype man? And I remember Chuck D laughed at that and he said, someone should do a book on Bundini. And that was always in the back of my mind after he said that. I thought, why hasn't there been a book on Drew Bundini Brown? I mean, he was part of what I loved about Ali.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm guessing after reading the book, and we're going to get into some of the things about him, you probably found him to be a more interesting and wide-ranging topic to write about than even maybe you thought at first, correct?
Oh, absolutely. I knew what most people know about Bundini, the rhymes, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. I knew his time with Sugar Ray Robinson. I knew Bundini as sort of a boxing person. I knew him from those Shaft movies with Richard Roundtree. If you remember, Bundini played Willie, the gangster
That's
from
right.
Harlem in those films. So that's what attracted me to the project. But when I learned about Bundini the man and learned about his life story, that's when I really started to realize that there was this amazing American story that even the best screenwriters couldn't make up. This kid who grew up in Central Florida and sets out in the Navy as a teenager and ends up, with no boxing background whatsoever in the entourage of maybe the greatest fighter ever in Sugar Ray Robinson. And then, of course, Robinson hands him off to the young Cassius Clay.
Yeah, it's amazing. And that journey had some interesting nuances to it, like the fact that when he, and I don't remember if he married her before or right after the Navy, he marries a white Orthodox Jewish lady in New York, thus making his, his associations with the world even more diverse.
Yeah, you got to think about it. He grew up in Sanford, Florida, where the Ku Klux Klan really had a strong presence during his childhood in Seminole County, Florida. So he grew up in this really segregated, problematic background, poor background as a young Black man. And then through the Navy and through his time in the Merchant Marines, ends up in Harlem in the jazz joints where he pals around with Miles Davis and all these jazz icons. And it was in one of those jazz clubs where he meets Rhoda Palestine, who was a white, Jewish woman from an Orthodox Jewish family in Brighton Beach, New York. And they have this marriage that goes against all the conventions of the day. And in some ways, writing about his relationship with Rhoda and, their son, who was raised a Jewish man, bicultural, biracial, Drew Brown III, that was more fun than writing about the Ali and Sugar Ray stuff in some ways.
Yeah.
It's just as improbable for that time period.
Yeah, totally astonishing. And you hit on the fact that, and you write about it in the book, there is something about Bundini that he gravitates, like you mentioned, Miles Davis. It's not like Ali was the first famous person he was around, or Sugar Ray Robinson. Somehow, and what do you think was the quality of this that made him just know these famous people or these gifted people?
It's funny. A lot of my students, a lot of the younger audience, see him as sort of just a member of Ali's entourage.
Yeah.
But he was a part of the most famous entourage ever with Sugar Ray Robinson way prior to that. He was this Zelig-like figure who just popped up when big things were happening, and his weapon was the English language.
Yeah.
He could talk, and he could maybe the only person who could out-talk the great Muhammad Ali. He was just someone who could read people like you and I read books. He was a hustler, but in the positive sense of the term. Gene Kilroy said this to me in an interview. He was someone who had no advantages in life, but anytime an advantage came his way, he snatched it. And that's good, Bundini Brown. He was a hustler.
That's a good comment. That's for sure. Now, so he's with Ray Robinson, of course, arguably the greatest fighter of all time, and Ali's idol. And tell people a little bit about how he moves from the Robinson entourage to Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, you got to think during his days with Sugar Ray, during the early portion of that, he was doing very menial work. He was an odd jobs guy. He was running errands for Sugar Ray. He even babysat his children. So he wasn't doing much glamorous stuff in those first couple of years. But eventually he gets invited to Greenwood Lake, where he trains with Sugar Ray and shatters him just the way he did Muhammad Ali. You got to remember when Ali comes out of the Olympics, he wins the gold medal. The first offer they made to be his trainer, the group of guys who were managing Ali, was to Sugar Ray Robinson. I mean, that was his idol, as you mentioned. He wanted Sugar Ray to be his trainer. And of course, Sugar Ray was still fighting at the time. He wasn't ready to be a full-time trainer. That back and forth happens for a couple years. And eventually when Ali fights Doug Jones in Madison Square Garden, they meet up, and Sugar Ray says to him, "I got a guy who can really get you straight, set your career up the right way, keep you focused in training." And of course, he says the famous line, "He's the only guy who can out-talk you." And it was Sugar Ray's brother-in-law who introduces the two right before the fight. It was the night before he fought Doug Jones.
Yeah, and of course the Doug Jones fight was not a great performance for Ali. Something that he won, but it wasn't. It was ironically it was before he had the great performance against Liston. But and people, you point out that Bundini Brown was more than just a cheerleader to Ali. People think of him in that light, and they think of him, the phrase hype man and all the rest, but he was more than that.
Yeah, absolutely. All of the folks who I interviewed for the book, who had a chance to train with Ali and had a chance to be a part of the time down in Miami, or the time at, Fighters Heaven in, Deer Lake, Pennsylvania, everyone sort of referred to Bundini as his spirit coach, his motivator. He woke him up for road work in the morning. He was there shadowing him through sparring and hitting a heavy bag and keeping his spirit up. And of course, during those first training camps, they coined a lot of those famous lines that we know: felt like a butterfly, sting like a bee. So he was there to keep Ali happy, to keep him motivated. And I also think Bundini was sort of this person in his life who was a reality check. Bundini would tell him exactly what was on his mind. And, he was a true friend who he could count on. And they butted heads a lot. Of course, so we'll talk about Ali fired him many times and bring him back.
That was going to be my next question to you, actually, about the fact that there was not always a smooth ride.
No, not at all. Everyone I talked to said a different number. Oh, he fired him 12 times. No, it was 8 times. No, it was 15 times. Everyone said something different. Bundini gets labeled a yes man, but really, the more research you do, he was the opposite of a yes man. Sometimes he said things that he maybe should have even kept to himself. I mean, as you mentioned, he lived his life very different than Ali. He was married to a white Jewish woman. He wore a Star of David necklace around his neck. He liked to drink, as we all know. He had a little problem with alcohol. He liked the nightclubs. Ali was living a much different life, especially in those early days. So they were very different in some ways, and Bundini would stand up to him, and sometimes when he would do that, it would get him fired. But they would always bring him back. And Gene Kilroy told me a great story. He said one day Ali was looking bad in the gym, and they said, a couple of the guys were talking and said, we need to get Bundini back. He's not working as hard. So they went over, waited for Ali to get in a good mood, and they said, don't you think it's boring around here, a little quiet without Bundini? Shouldn't we give him a second chance? And Ali begrudgingly said, bring him back. But, they knew Ali was just better in the gym with him. And maybe that's where the magic really happened. It wasn't just in the corner of those fights.
Yeah.
The way he was there, keeping Ali up and motivated. And it just brought more fun to the atmosphere of training, which, is, it's grueling, 6 to 8 weeks, repetitious behavior. It's not the most fun thing in the world to go to a training camp. And Bundini he kept Ali up. He kept him motivated, and also made it fun too.
Eddie Mustafa Muhammad told me a story about when he was training in the Ali at Deer Lake. When he was light heavyweight champion, Ali had invited him to come and train. He said in the morning, Bundini Brown would kick the door open and fire a shotgun in the air to wake everybody up. So, which I thought was pretty funny, but in keeping with his nature. But as the Ali career went on, of course, Bundini got his own, identity. And did that identity was that ever part of the friction between them? Him being this kind of figure that got a certain kind of attention?
Yeah, you got to think right after the Joe Frazier fight, when Ali comes back from exile, that's when Bundini starts doing the Hollywood movies. And you go through his resume, he was in 6 feature films. He was even in The Color Purple by Steven
That's
Spielberg.
Amazing.
Oprah was in that, and Whoopi Goldberg, and of course Quick Tillis, who Bundini was training on the side, was in the movie as well. Bundini had his own set of friends. He had his own, it's Kalia Ali who said to me, a lot of the famous people Ali met for the first time, it was Bundini introducing him to these people. They had met Bundini first. He had his own life outside of Ali. I don't know if that ever really got in the way of their friendship.
Yeah.
I think that was the case, but I do think Bundini had a lot more going on than maybe some people realize, right?
You mentioned the movies that he was in, and I thought one of the most endearing parts of the book was his son, who would read the scripts to him because he needed that, and would act out the parts and everything. I thought that was and of course his son was a big part of your research for the book.
Yeah, I couldn't have written this book without the help of his son, Drew Brown III. And, I spent 14 months with him. I went down to his home in Atlanta multiple times. He let me look at his dad's, he had writings and books that he never finished. Bundini couldn't read or write on an adult level, but his wife, Rhoda, who you mentioned earlier, would type up his manuscripts, and he would stand over her shoulder and he would write poems. He tried to write plays. He tried to write a book about his time with Sugar Ray. And I got to read all that stuff. And I got to look through all their personal artifacts. And it was so exciting. But one of my favorite stories is that when he got the deal with Shaft, of course, it was Gene Kilroy who hooked that up. Bundini couldn't necessarily read the script. So his son would memorize the lines and they would practice in the kitchen together. And still to this day, his son knows every line in both of those Shaft movies. And he can recite them and he sounds just like his dad. And I thought that was a cool father-son bonding story of Bundini sitting in the kitchen, doing his parts, and his son would play Shaft, and they would go back and forth and practice the lines. And, Ali and Angelo and all those guys loved those movies too. Angelo's son told me that, his dad went to the premiere and just got a kick out of it. They were so happy for Bundini that he was in a big Hollywood movie like that.
And it's interesting you bring up Angelo Dundee, longtime Ali trainer. He and Bundini Brown were able to mesh together, and of course Angelo's very good at one of his great talents is finding ways to create relationships with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because when I went into this book, I knew for a fact that those two must have really disliked each other. I just knew it. And because my dad, when he was a trainer, he liked a really quiet corner. And he was the only guy who talked. And I used to work corners with my dad. And I would get the stool out and I would be doing all the stuff, but I would not talk. So I assumed Angelo was that way. But according to his son and the people I talked to, like Gene Kilroy and others in the entourage, they really hit it off well. And early on, Angelo realized Bundini brought something to the equation that he didn't. And he just like Gene Kilroy understood Ali was a little better with him. And they found a way to work it out together and coexist. And his son actually told me that sometimes on good days, Angelo would try to do the rhymes with them. He'd try to come up with his own rhymes. And, of course, Bundini was the poet of the group. So, they would tease him about his rhymes. Intriguing.
You, as you did this book, was there I know many things probably that you found out about Bundini that were intriguing. What was the most surprising to you?
Yeah, the most surprising thing to me is I would have never imagined the life that his son and grandchildren live today. His son was a college basketball player and a first generation college graduate. His son was a motivational speaker. He was a fighter pilot in the Navy. Bundini was kicked out of the Navy when he was, a teenager. Right. His life really came full circle, and he really wanted his son to go to college. And multiple times in his childhood, he would say, "Dad, I want to be like Ali, or I want to be like Sugar Ray." And he would say, "No, Drew, you're going to be the educated Drew. You're going to college." And maybe that's not what we would expect from Bundini, right? We see him as this wild, kind of charismatic guy, but he was in a lot of ways a really good father. And his son went on to do some pretty amazing things, and his grandchildren are doing some really amazing things out in the world. His grandson is a spine surgeon. His granddaughter is a lawyer in DC. It's just really neat to see the whole story. And as you mentioned, Bundini, we lost him back in 1987. And I'm so glad that the book came out now when it did, so we could tell the full story about, how his philosophies and life lessons have went on to, show up in the lives of his family members.
That's the part about this book that I find fascinating, because people will go in, you say the title of it, Bundini Brown, Don't Believe the Hype, is a great title, because you will go into this book with certain ideas and you will leave with, different ideas and embellishments on anything you could have thought about him, because you're going to find out all these things that will surprise you. And and a life, certainly a life well lived, and a life that has many more nuances than people would ever expect.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we all know Bundini's persona, and he had this public persona. I tried not to hide, his demons or shy away from his downfalls. He was someone who struggled with alcohol. He was not the most faithful husband to his wife, and they ended up divorced. He had his demons, and of course, he and Ali had some serious tiffs too. Bundini didn't really get along with the Nation of Islam. He wasn't that big on some of the teachings of the nation. Those frictions were real. There were a lot of things that have been written about Bundini that are true, but I wanted you to see him as a man, as a husband, as a son. I wanted to talk about his tragic childhood, and he did have a very tragic childhood. And for him to make it out of those circumstances and achieve the things he achieved in life, I think it's a brilliant American story. It's like I said earlier, the kind of thing, if it were in a movie made up, you wouldn't believe it. This is too exaggerated. No one can come from that and travel the world the way he did. He lived an amazing life, and I wanted to tell the full gambit of his story.
Well, you did that, and it's just an excellent book, and I urge everybody to, if you're a boxing fan or you have even the slightest interest in the Ali Bundini Brown whole story, and you even know about that era, you're going to find out some fascinating things that you didn't know, and you're going to learn about a man who was very different than you imagined he might be. Todd, I appreciate you visiting with us, and the best of luck with the book, which is a superb literary effort.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and it's a blessing to get a chat with you about it. So thank you, Al.
Thanks, Todd.
All right, take care.
So that was our chat with Todd Snyder, and I assure you that you will enjoy the read. If you have even a casual interest in Muhammad Ali, and who doesn't, or Bundini Brown, if you know of him, or even if you don't know of him and you're a younger boxing fan and you want to relive some of the Ali history through the lens of the man that was right beside him all the way, this book is a terrific book, and you should pick it up. Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype, published by Hamilcar, which is a terrific boxing publishing company. Now, Tripp, I believe that we have some more questions, do we not?
We do, but real quick before the questions, do you ever, as someone, we grew up in the same era, will there ever be a boxer as famous as Ali ever again?
It's a valid question. You can make the case that there are international celebrities like Manny Pacquiao, who's known worldwide. Floyd Mayweather would be an example in more recent vintage. One of the things that I think prevents that is that while the world has gotten smaller and we can know everybody through social media, I think it's hard for one figure to dominate like that. So I don't know if a boxer is going to gain that kind of world acclaim, but we've seen to the two people I mentioned, Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather, we've seen two fighters who are certainly have worldwide following. And you can look at a fighter in MMA like a Conor McGregor, for instance, who has an amazing worldwide following. And so clearly, you can reach a certain level. It's just hard to imagine. Ali's one of those iconic figures that literally was known to everyone on the planet. And even today, in our age of social media, that's a hard thing to achieve.
Yeah, except for a Kardashian, but that's another story.
Well, yeah. Well, when you're that talented and have that much to offer, of course, you're going to exceed everyone else. He said tongue firmly implanted in cheek.
Well, that is a clever lead-in to another fighter who may think he has the world right behind him, and that's Adrian Broner. Miguel writes in, thoughts on a potential Broner-Prograis fight?
Yes, this, of course, has to deal with my friend Adrian, who is the charter member of the Al Bernstein fan club. The question asks about him fighting Regis Prograis, who, of course, is a former 140-pound champion. And that's a fight that has been talked about. First, Adrian Broner has to fight on February 13th. That fight will be on Showtime, and I'll be announcing it. And they're looking for the opponent because his first opponent fell out because he had COVID, and now they're scrambling to find the next opponent for him. If Broner wins that fight, it is a very good chance that they may make the fight with Regis Prograis, who is a terrific fighter who has had only one loss in his career, and that was to Josh Taylor, and lost his world title in the process. A very close fight that could have gone either way. And, for Broner, clearly, he hasn't fought in 2 years. He hasn't had a win in a fight in 3 years. Well chronicled are his issues, legal, financial, and even emotional, that he's suffered outside the ring. So this fight back in February represents an important step for him in terms of his boxing career at age 31, which isn't that old in boxing, but still you're headed toward a period in your career where you need to make sure that you're winning and fighting in meaningful fights. And because he hasn't been very successful in the last couple of years, how much longer will that be tolerated by fans and everyone else that dictates whether big fights happen? So we'll see. I think the Prograis-Broner fight as a fight is a challenging one for Broner. Prograis is a left-hander who can punch in volume, which is a big issue for Broner, and has power, and is a very natural 140-pounder. So I think it's a very difficult fight, one in which Broner would go in as the underdog, to be sure.
Unless you asked him, and that's another story.
He would feel confident, I'm sure, that he would win the fight, but lately it hasn't gone that way for him, but we'll see.
I can't imagine any fighters not liking you, but it's happened every once in a while. How is it to call a fight with someone who has thrown some barbs at you?
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's a very valid question. And, for those that don't know, all they have to do is Google Adrian Broner and I, and you'll find out on social media that he and I had an interesting press conference and it went viral. I have had very few experiences where I've had confrontational situations with boxers. Just hasn't happened that often. I'm not saying everybody adores me, but for the most part, I've had very good relationships with boxers. I hope I've treated them with respect, and they've felt that. But on occasion, that's going to happen. And in Broner's case, he's not fond of me. And so when you're calling a fight, and I have said this publicly before, I'll admit to a faux pas I committed. After all that, it was even before the issue with Adrian Broner, when I was calling the fight in which Adrian Broner fought Paulie Malignaggi, who was a colleague of mine at that time in Showtime, I admitted, or thought about later, and I did admit to the fact that I believe I actually, in my effort to be fair to Broner, I probably was more fair than I needed to be, in the sense that I probably subconsciously shifted my commentary to be a little more favorable to him than I should have been in a very close fight. And I said to Paulie, I apologize for doing that. It was not done intentionally. It just kind of happened. And he was very gracious about it. And I believe I did that. And you do that when you want to be very sure that you're being fair. Now, fast forward to the Adrian Broner press conference before the Pacquiao fight, in which he, was not too kind to me. And how's that for a euphemism? And I had to call his fight with Pacquiao, and subsequently had to call his fight another fight. And that was the last fight that I did. So he had to fight Manny Pacquiao, and I had to call that fight without malice, and try to be as fair as is humanly possible. And I believe that you can do that, because I try to take it out of that realm and look at everything that's happening in the ring, and employ the techniques that I always employ doing a fight. So I'm going to talk about how many punches does he throw around, what are his strengths, what has happened in fights like this. I'm going to take all the things that are the things that you can quantify that I do, and then watch what I'm seeing and be honest about what I'm seeing. And I think it's incumbent upon anybody doing that to try and be as fair as they can be. And so for me, I don't find it to be something that's impossible to do. Doesn't change how you feel about somebody, or it doesn't change whether you're distressed at an interaction, but you can do your job the right way.
Okay, good to hear. Redminster asks, what is the best book you've read on the sport of boxing? Fiction, non, or both?
That would be hard to say because I've read so many books, but I'm just going to pluck one out to use as an example of a great book that I read that maybe not everybody's aware of and that I think was a fantastic read. It's called The Ghosts of Manila. It is a book written by the late Mark Cram, whose son, Mark Cram Jr., is also a fine writer and has written extensively about boxing. Mark Cram was a phenomenal writer at Sports Illustrated in the 70s and 80s and maybe into the 90s as well, I'm going to say. And he covered the Ali Frazier fight, among other fights in that era. And wrote a book in the early 2000s called The Ghosts of Manila, as I mentioned. And in it, he revisited that fight and revisited Ali and Frazier's rivalry. It is, I think, a unique look at how these two men interacted. And one of the things that makes it unique is he doesn't shortchange Joe Frazier in this book. You know, Muhammad Ali is a big figure, and Muhammad Ali is one of those people that, as you mentioned, worldwide known to literally everyone, and somebody who demands most of the oxygen in the room and most of the oxygen in a discussion that relates to him. Mark Cram didn't quite approach it that way. He wanted to make sure that Joe Frazier was talked about in this book in a way that was appropriate for Joe Frazier's part in this and how much he contributed to that fight and to the rivalry with Muhammad Ali, which isn't to say he shortchanged Ali, but I thought that was one unique aspect of it. So the book is brilliantly written, and anybody who is mildly interested in boxing at least is aware of that great rivalry. So that's one of the ones that I would point to. What are some of your favorite boxing or sports books?
Well, and you just put me on the spot here, but it's very interesting. There's some great humor writers from Sports Illustrated who have been through there. Rick Riley, everything that he writes.
He was great.
I love Mark Mulvoy, the hockey writer. Sports Illustrated at a time was the best spot you could go. And when you were talking about being down in Manila, for a while, if you're a Sports Illustrated writer, you had the best expense account. You flew first class. Yeah. It was a good gig. Now, you've written a couple boxing books. Do you want to hype them right now?
Yeah, I did write the book, 30 Years, 30 Undeniable Truths about boxing, sports, and TV, which will not be mentioned in the same light as Mark Cram's book. But it was, I hope it's a fun read, and if people get a chance to look at it, they can take a peek. And you can hold my question in abeyance, and somewhere on a future podcast you can answer it. But I love what you said about the Sports Illustrated writers, because for me, as a youngster, the first inkling I had that I wanted to be a writer or a sports journalist, whether it's in writing or in the media, was reading Sports Illustrated. My mom got me a subscription to Sports Illustrated for my 10th birthday, or 9th or 10th birthday, and it was right around the time when Floyd Patterson was fighting Sonny Liston, and Floyd was on the cover, and I loved Floyd Patterson, and it was. When I read those stories, and some of them probably were a little beyond where I should be reading because they were so well written and the vocabulary in those stories was so good, but I still got through it, and it helped me learn about writing and learn about the use of the English language. So you're right to to praise those great writers in Sports Illustrated, some of the best writers ever in sports or non-sports. Well, we're going to have next week one of the best boxers of the last 25 or 30 years. The great Andre Ward will be joining us as our guest. He, of course, is now will be inducted into the Hall of Fame. He has been named as one of the inductees to the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and we always look forward to chatting with Andre. And in our next show, we're going to chat with him.
But first, we have to mention our friend Tom Yankello.
Yeah, and of course, a gentleman who works with Hall of Famers. He's worked with Roy Jones Jr., and many others. A fine trainer, Tom Yankello, who has a great website, the World Class Boxing Channel, which actually a YouTube channel, World Class Boxing, in which he does some great videos about the sport. They're partially instructional, but they're also historical. And you can learn the sport from the ground up by looking at his videos. So you want to go check that out, World Class Boxing on YouTube, and you can get some great insights into the sport of boxing from Tom. So I want to thank Tripp, of course, for his fine efforts. Also Todd Snyder for joining us. Very happy that I was able to interview him. Again, if you enjoy boxing books, Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype is a great read, and you'll enjoy it. It's published by Hamilcar Publishing. And of course, my thanks to all of you for joining us on this, and we'll see you next time.